Greetings from Nebraska. I'm very honored to have an opportunity to share a few things that we have learned over this past year relative to the perceptions of barriers and benefits of manure use in cropping systems. My name is Rick Koelsch. I am with the University of Nebraska, and I'd also like to recognize my collaborators from Iowa State University and the University of Minnesota in this activity. I think we're all aware of the importance of recycling nutrients within our animal agricultural systems. Our ability to move the nutrients that an animal excretes in manure into our soils and cropping systems, produce animal feeds and possibly other crops as well, and then return those animal feeds to the animal. That recycling loop is extremely important to the sustainability of our animal agricultural systems. Now, in today's environment here in Nebraska, we are challenged by an increasing separation between those places or those facilities that are producing animals and those farms or businesses that are producing the crops. And as that separation grows greater in terms of distance or in terms of just business entity separation, that of our ability to continue that recycling loop is continuously challenged. And as we think about the importance of moving manure nutrients to fields that have historically not had manure, and moving those nutrients further and further away from our animal feeding operations, this is a challenge that we need to understand and do a better job of here in many of our Midwestern states. To better understand how we're going to address some of these challenges, we felt it was important to conduct a survey of perceptions of manure's benefits and barriers. And there were two questions in particular we wanted to answer. We wanted to learn what challenges rise to a level that prevents manure use in crop production, and then what is understood and valued relative to manure's potential benefits. We had an opportunity to interact with a number of stakeholder groups as we defined the questions that went into that survey, and we had a number of wonderful partners that helped us in terms of that promotion of that survey, including the Manure Manager magazine and the Certified Crop Advisor program. In terms of who participated, we had roughly 900 survey responses that we were able to utilize in our results, and many of them came from the Midwest region, the Corn Belt, in through the Mid-Atlantic region of the US. So there is a little bit of bias relative to location of where these responses are coming from that you need to be aware of. In terms of the tremendous promotion that we had from the American Agronomy Society, we had a significant response from the advisory community, especially the private sector advisory community. But even though we had a strong response there, we still had more than 200 animal feeding operations that responded and more than 300 crop production farms that responded. We'll start with just an introduction to what we learned from three specific questions and then share a few take-home messages in terms of the overall survey. One of the questions that we wanted to understand, to what degree do you value or do you consider manure to either be a benefit or a harm relative to certain field or characteristics in crop production? Two of our questions related to agronomic issues, how important or how valuable is manure in terms of crop fertility and nutrition and in terms of yield. And as you can see, overwhelmingly, individuals that responded felt that manure was beneficial or at least slightly beneficial, and there was almost no responses over here in the harmful or slightly harmful range. When we asked a similar question relative to soil health or soil characteristics from both a physical and a biological perspective, there was overwhelmingly a response that favored manure as being beneficial or at least slightly beneficial. The only question that we answered relative to this that had kind of a mixed review was in the area of water quality. Just over a third of those that participated saw manure as being beneficial to water quality, and just under a third of those that participated saw manure as being harmful to water quality. And as we've gone through a couple of decades of defining practices and regulatory approaches that minimize the risk of manure to water quality, I think we understand why many of our answers are on that harmful side. But we're seeing a growing trend of individuals responding that manure offers benefits in terms of water quality. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. We also asked in terms of when manure and fertilizer are compared, what do you believe to be the most true? And we were trying to understand in terms of is a competitive environment for manure versus fertilizer, or is it more of a complementary environment? And we were rather surprised by some of the responses that we got from this survey. 70% of those that responded suggested that manure and fertilizer were in complementary roles. In terms of those that felt it was competitive, we had a rather small percentage that believed fertilizer was preferred in that competitive role or that manure was preferred. And I think the reason for this large response in this area comes back to who actually responded to the survey. And since this was a voluntary survey, we saw those that had been frequent users of manure in the past tended to dominate the responses of this survey. If I was to ask this same question with our typical Nebraska corn producer, I would think we would see this competitive environment where manure is preferred being the more dominant response. So this response, I think, is more connected with the audience that identified themselves or chose to respond to this survey. So what were some takeaways relative to the benefits of manure? I think we were pleased to see that there is a strong peer group within agriculture, both in the consulting and in the production side of agriculture, that values and understands the agronomic and soil health benefits of manure. I think based upon that, one of the questions that we've been raising here in Nebraska is how do we involve this peer group more and more in telling the story of where manure is valued and why it might be considered as part of a fertility program. We also have been thinking in terms of how do we help farmers target fields to achieve the greatest value from manure for specific fields. So what fields benefit from a soil health perspective? What is the economic return of one field versus another from more the agronomic or soil fertility perspective or value of manure? And so how do we tell that story more clearly? And we are asking more and more about how do we define complementary manure and fertilizer fertility strategies so that we're taking advantage of that complementary value of the two products together. One other question or perception that we have relative to manure's benefits relates back to this water quality response and that mixed response that we saw. We think we need to do probably a better job of helping farmers understand and articulate what are the water quality risks with over-application of manure, which has been our history, versus the water quality risk associated with an agronomic application. I think there's a strong case to be made in terms of manure's benefits, in terms of reducing erosion and runoff from fields that have received manure, and in terms of the less mobility of some of our organic packaged nutrients as opposed to our inorganic nutrient sources. And so can we tell this story, help farmers be able to articulate that better, to better represent the advantages of manure is from a water quality perspective. Our second set of questions focused around the challenges associated with using manure and which of these challenges rise to the level of becoming a barrier that prevents manure use in some cropping systems. We provided people with roughly 35 alternative challenges to pull from and asked them to identify those challenges that became a barrier to manure use, and wanted to share with you our top 10 from this group of challenges. As you might expect, the top challenges out of this top 10 were associated with economics, transportation and application costs rising to the very top. Second on this was neighbor-related issues. Issues such as odor became a barrier for 8 out of 10 of those that responded, at least in some of the fields in which they had hoped to apply manure to. We had several logistical issues that rose to the top. Some issues such as timeliness of the application, field conditions that limited application, time and labor requirements. And in particular, I'm interested about, in my just observations here in Nebraska, about the connection between this issue and transportation cost. I think I often hear people decide it is inappropriate to move manure because of the cost of transportation, when they're often talking in terms of the accessibility of labor, the accessibility of equipment for making that haul of manure an extra few miles. And so what's the connection between those is something I would like to understand better. Several issues related to agronomic concerns in terms of such things as compaction, uniformity, and weed seeds. Our ability to respond to some of these kind of questions is going to be important if we're going to help crop farmers become greater users of the manure in their fertility programs. And then the last issue that we put into our top 10, or showed up in our top 10, was regulatory issues. Manure's perception that it is more regulated than commercial fertilizers is preventing manure being distributed further away from our animal feeding operations to fields that have historically not had manure. And so in some ways, our regulations may actually be impeding improvements in water quality because of that perception. So what are some takeaways from the barrier side of this discussion? In terms of economics, I think we need to better understand how we can reduce transportation costs, and are those transportation costs related to just the availability of the labor and equipment, or is it just financially too expensive? I think we've seen in a number of places here in Nebraska where we've developed a strong service sector for brokering manure, transporting manure, and application of manure. And in those situations, it's been my observation that manure is moved further and further from its traditional application sites. I think we also need to understand how we're going to address neighbor issues, strategies that will reduce odor. As an example, in Nebraska, where we surface apply a lot of our manure, we've spent a fair amount of time focusing on the role of 3 to 5 day weather forecast for identifying neighbors and fields that are higher risk or lower risk. And then we'll briefly wrap up with the fact that there's a number of logistical agronomic barriers to manure. And as a general rule, I think we need to think in terms of what should be the 4 R's like we have with fertilizer products. What are those 4 R's for manure, and how can they help us address some of the logistical and agronomic challenges? So that summarizes what we've learned from our survey. I appreciate the time to share those ideas with you, and I look forward to the conversations that we might follow in our Q&A session. Thank you.